So as we transitioned into Western Heritage Chapter 9 here, finishing up the late Middle Ages, we talk about some of the social and political breakdowns that were going on of the feudal system, but it might be a little bit deceiving to say a breakdown because in reality, in some ways, we're moving towards a stronger national movements. We'll talk about that several times here. So a chapter summary of kind of what to expect. It's a time of crisis and calamity, right? There's the rise of nationalism. Nationalism, this idea of, right, in the feudal period, in the Middle Ages, after the breakdown of the Roman Empire, different feudal lords gained land and would fight one another and sometimes unite and sometimes divide, but there wasn't a lot of national unity. Nobody was running around saying, well, I'm French, or I'm English, or I'm German, or I'm Italian. It was people who were saying, I'm from Normandy, I'm from Burgundy, I'm Anglo-Saxon, I'm Burgundian, or another group, you name it. But there starts to be, in the 1300s, a movement towards greater national unity. In fact, it's one of the reasons, and war often brings about unity in a kind of paradoxical way. But England and France get involved in what becomes known as the 100 Years' War. It actually lasts about 116 years, and it wasn't a continuous war. It was fought off and on in three kind of main periods, interrupted by things like plagues and treaties. And we'll talk about the impact of the plague shortly. We're also going to talk about ecclesiastical breakdown in this chapter as the Middle Ages are starting to change. The church is starting to have some of its power questioned, and they're going to fight to maintain it, and that's going to lead to some power struggles. And then we're going to briefly talk about some early pre-reformers, as we're not quite to the Reformation yet, but there are those who are kind of paving the way for it. And then briefly the role of medieval Russia, and we'll ask ourselves, why do they belong in Western history, or do they? So, the Hundred Years' War and the context for the growth of nationalism. What was happening, as we said, was that the feudal system was evolving. And so, some nobles would gain more power than others, right? Whether that was through marriage, through conquest. But they were supposed to be loyal to the king. But the problem here was that in the royal families, right, you might be part of the official royal, most noble families. Maybe through marriage, you could be a cousin, your mother could be related, or different connections. And so what eventually develops is that the King of England and the King of France are both saying that they have, through their parents, rights to the throne. So the King of England says, I own France. The King of France says, I own England. So that's not at all complicated. Right, and the king in this, right, the kings are over these large territories, these large little kingdoms, with some degrees of questions of loyalty in some places, especially, for example, in France, where the Burgundians' territories were actually more loyal to the King of England. Nonetheless, the peasants and the people of the land were willing and being rallied to fight in these wars for what they believed was their nation. So again, you get this sense of you're fighting for national pride, and a lot of it has to do with your culture, a lot with your history, with your language, for example, right? The English speak English, the French speak French. And so that's important as we move. And so as we talk about the 100 Years' War and the causes, right, it's between England and France, like I said, and it wasn't a continuous war, but there was a controversy over the French throne. Should the King of England rule France, or should the King of France rule England? And again, on both sides, there's this growing sense of national identity, which is really important when you think about this in history. We had the old empires, the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, the Persian Empire, etc. But now we had this shift for about 1,000 years, right after the fall of the Roman Empire, about 900 years, where there was no unifying themes, unifying ideas, maybe besides the church, to say, well, I'm from this country, I'm from that country, or from this or that nation. But as England and France start to come together, this pattern is going to shape Western history, Western society, down to the present day, so that in the 1800s you're going to see, for example, Germany finally come together and be unified. You're going to see Italy come together and be unified. But England and France are kind of leading the way at this time in history, right? And they're both interested in economic and territorial gain. And again, it's complicated when you get two different groups claiming the same territory and vying for political power. So again, early on, right, the early victories, the French should have been winning. They had superior numbers. They were fighting on home soil. They had better resources. But the English had at least one thing going for them, and that is the famous English longbow. right? And they had these famous archers that could pierce, it was said, the armor of a knight at 200 yards. And so you get these very powerful French cavalry and French knights that would win in hand-to-hand combat, but weren't always able to get close to the English with their longbows, so one of their crucial weapons. Edward III is the English king who kind of kicks some things off and is claiming some French territory. And he wins some important battle at Sluys, Crécy, and Calais in northern parts of France. I'll show you a map in just a second. And then in a later phase of the war, again much later, decades later, Henry V comes to the throne in England, and he needs to kind of unite the English people around his throne and gather some strength. So he comes up with a strategy to unite, and that's what better way to get people to be on the same page than to have a common enemy, the French. And so he goes and he campaigns, and he crosses the border till you see the little star there, to Harfleur Castle. And his plan with this large, in that day and age, little excursion is to take Harfleur and some of the other castles. Well, if he gets bogged down at Harfleur, hardly makes it. But he also, back going to his ancestor Edward III, up to the north in Calais, and if you see that just a little further up the coast, just across from London and English Channel, he decides he's going to prove that he's the king here by marching to Calais with the remainder of his army. But I'll show you a map here of just a second of the problem they run into. There's Calais, you see it on the map. So what you find, right, is in the effort to march from Harfleur to Calais, that's all well and good until you have to cross rivers. And what he encountered, what Henry V and his troops encountered, was the entire French army on the other side of this one river. They had no choice, right? They're sick, it's rainy, the weather's not great, and so they head inland looking for an ideal place to cross, hoping to not get cut off. They finally do manage to, right? They're tired and they're exhausted, and they're marching toward Calais, only to get stopped with nowhere to turn, with the entire French army in front of them at Agincourt. And right, the battle lines look something like this. And amazingly, right, that numerically there's estimates that the English had between 5,000 and 6,000 troops left, quite a few longbowmen, and the French had somewhere around 30,000 troops, right? And this is the lords and nobles that had come from all over France to stop this invasion. And so it looked like there was no chance that the English would win, but in some amazing turns of events and strategies where, again, at that time, it's interesting, in battle, you wouldn't just kill everyone. The goal was to capture enemy nobles, and then you could sell them for ransom. You could make a lot of money that way. Well, the English, because they were so vastly outnumbered, they originally started to capture some of the English nobles because the mud and the rain was so terrible in the fields that they were able to basically just bog them down and surround them. But there were so many of them that they ended up just having to slaughter and kill a lot of them because they couldn't afford to have those they had captured all of a sudden turn on them. And so this battle is significant for a number of reasons. One, it's a major English victory against odds, so it's one that they celebrate and they sing about back in England. But secondly, it also is going to devastate the French nobility and really kind of put them in a political upheaval, so much so that not long after Henry V is able to march and actually kind of take Paris, France itself, and become, he and his descendants become declared the kings of France for a short time. So after the Battle of Agincourt and a number of other battles, there's eventually a truce drawn at the Treaty of Troyes between which basically means the new heir to the French throne is Henry VI, right, the descendant of Henry V. And the English are winning for a time until, right, the famous Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, or Maid of Orleans, rallies the French army under Charles VII, and eventually helps the French to win. Now, she's controversial, and she's eventually actually captured by the Burgundians, who are technically in France, but at the time were allies of the English. And the English execute her for heresy because she claimed that she had seen visions from God. The results, though, right, even though she's tried, is that the French eventually win, and there's a strong nationalism raised at home, and eventually they're able to push back the English, take back their territories, and the English, right, in having lost a lot of these battles, there's major upheaval for them even at home, and they're dealing with their own issues with plague, disease, peasant rebellions, and even some religious issues where they're persecuting the Lollards, who we'll talk about shortly. So, in the midst of all this, right? So, as the Hundred Years' War is going on, right in the middle of it is when the Black Death hits, and so there wasn't really a lot of fighting at that time. But the populations were booming as more and more food was becoming available through increased technology. Um, but there was a number of crop failures in the mid 1300s, and when people are hungry, population's up, and all of a sudden food supply goes down, leads to weakened immune system. So that surely didn't help. Right, there's a lot of theories out there that it was fleas and that came on the backs of rats, maybe from the Middle East or Africa or somewhere. Any way that it happened, right? The disease was spread through sneezes, through trade, as people, again, the merchant class was moving all over Europe, and even superstitious practices, right? There were those who felt that, for example, in the church, that to deal with it, this disease was clearly punishment from God, and so they needed to beat themselves and into submission and show God their sorrow. Well, when there's disease around and people are beating themselves to the point of bleeding, that actually spreads disease. So, in fact, their efforts to get rid of the disease probably made it worse. Right, the effects of the disease overall, right? You get the flagellants, those who would actually would beat themselves, right? A lot of superstitious practices like sitting down in sewers and yeah, a lot of them. Obsession with death, right? People saw death all around them in ways that we can't imagine, and so a lot of art and just writings and things were focused on that. Strong sense of hopelessness for many. A lot of disillusionment with just religion, with the church, with government politics, and some, right, kind of went Epicurean. I remember the Greek philosophers, and they just said, well, just pursue pleasure to the fullest, and just make the most of life because you might die tomorrow. All different ways that people tried to deal with the plague and its effects. Right, an eyewitness of the plague said it was realizing what a deadly disaster had come to them. The people quickly drove the Italians from their city, but the disease remained, and soon death was everywhere. Fathers abandoned their sick sons, lawyers refused to come and make out wills for the dying, friars and nuns were left to care for the sick, and monasteries and convents were soon deserted as they were stricken too. Bodies were left in empty houses, and there was no one to give them a Christian burial. Again, quite a terrifying disease that spread. Some would argue between a third to half of the entire population of Western Europe was killed during the Black Death, just those few years. So some of the social and economic consequences, you can imagine how much that would change kind of just the face of Europe. First of all, the labor class is affected. A lot of, groups were wiped out, farmers, artisans in towns and villages, and it actually led to a shift toward towns, right? People actually would kind of flee the countryside. They maybe couldn't handle things. They thought they were fleeing towards safety or towards medicine. So it didn't necessarily mean that they were going to be safe, but it did lead to increased urbanization, which is all the more going to lead to a breakdown in the feudal system. The nobles, right? It's interesting. They were forced to pay more to their peasants to stay on the lands and to farm and to work because there was such a demand for laborers because so many of them were dying. And don't forget that the nobles were impacted the same way that the peasants were, right? That diseases don't just decide who they are going to attack based on last name. The clergy were affected, right? They were just likely to get sick, but the church did actually make a lot of money because they were doing so many burial rites, demands for masses and for religious help to try to deal with the diseases. So the church actually became more powerful during the Black Plague. And cities were hit especially hard, but again, even they benefit from changing supply and demand. So the Black Death is having a major impact on Europe, and the Hundred Years' War has been fought, and nationalism's growing. There was also issues with the church, so we get some ecclesiastic breakdown, right? The ecclesiastics referring to the church. In the 13th century, the church was really strong. In the 1200s, Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, was out, right? He'd been ousted by his own German nobles and princes and alliances with the Pope. Louis IX was the king of France at the time, and he was very supportive of the church and of the Pope, strongly, devoutly pious and Catholic. And Innocent III was a very strong pope, at least from a political perspective, although surely corrupt in some aspects. There were signs of trouble, though, even in the 1200s. First of all, the church was becoming more and more secularized as The Pope was growing its power. There was disagreement over who the rightful Pope ought to be, right? The College of Cardinals had been founded to decide that, but there were those who didn't always see and agree that whatever Pope, whether from the East or the West or from Italy or France or wherever, should actually be over the Church. Unum Sanctum was a bull that was passed during this period. A bull is an official declaration by the Catholic Church, and this basically declared that the Pope had sole authority in the Church. It's one of the most powerful statements of papal infallibility. Again, that means that the Pope can't be wrong. During this period, there was also an accusation of heresy of the Knights Templar. Remember the knights whose responsibility it was to protect Christians traveling back and forth from the Holy Land after the First Crusade. Well, the Knights Templar were accused of all sorts of heinous crimes, and that's also going to kind of weaken the overall authority of the Church, as people are going to question the morality of these supposed devout Catholics. For a period, actually about 70 years, the papacy, the seat of the Church, actually gets moved from Rome in the Papal States to Avignon in France, and so that's not exactly, again, a sign that the Church is doing particularly well. So the Avignon papacy you see up there, off just to the left on that map where it is. So it's not really far out of Italy, but surely there's a major shift. And you see the picture there. It's where the capital in Avignon today, where the head of the Catholic Church was for about 70 years. Now, what that looked like, right, during that period, right, is that there was taxation of clergy, and the Church really started doing things like selling indulgences, partially because of the Black Death. But in general, they were offering people release from purgatory for them or family members by paying things to the Church. There was controversy over who the next pope should be, so much so that during this period there were actually a group, and we'll talk about who they are in just a minute, but known as the Conciliarists, guys like William of Ockham, who said things like this: the Church is best guided not by popes, but by Scripture and by councils representing all the Christian faithful. And we should find that interesting, right? Because we tend to think of the Catholic Church as this big unified group who has always been behind the Pope, but in fact there were periods late in, close to the actual Protestant Reformation where Catholics themselves would question the wisdom of supporting a single Pope, and instead felt like church councils ought to make better decisions. Another conciliarist, Marsilio of Padua, wrote a piece called Defender of Peace, in which it said it was a state's exclusive God-given right to use force to maintain social order. So if the Pope or the Church is behaving in a negative way, he said it was the state that could actually intervene. So what you're going to have is what becomes known as this great schism, right? Great division in the Church, and this is where there was a question: should Urban VI or Clement VII be the next pope? Two of them were elected by two different groups, and so the conciliarists, again, this group who, again, that meaning conciliarists from council, this council gets together and they say, we've got a solution. Neither of them will be the pope. We'll come up with our own pope. Instead, right, they said if the pope fails in their mission to protect the well-being of the people of the Church, his people have a natural right to depose him to save the Church. So they are arguing against papal infallibility, which is what Innocent III and others had claimed. Right? Well, in 1409, they solved the problem at the Council of Pisa by choosing another pope, and neither Urban nor Clement was willing to give up. And so for a brief period, there was actually 3 popes over the Roman Catholic Church all at the same time. Now, which one was infallible, and we'll let them figure it out. Right, the Council of Constance, right, not long after that, is where they actually decided for themselves that councils should be declared the ultimate source of church authority, which that's all well and good, but actually the councils are going to shortly thereafter lose a lot of their power, and the popes will reclaim it. But it's interesting that the same council that many of us as even Protestants would applaud and say, good job listening to the councils instead of trusting the authority of one man, that seems dangerous, they also condemn the teachings of a man named John Wycliffe, right, who was working on translating the scriptures into the vernacular, into the English language, and was preaching, in some ways, the authority of Scripture and preaching against some of the teachings of the Catholic Church. So 1431 to 49, right, the power of the councils, like I said, eventually starts to decline. So right, the precedents, though, had been set that it was the responsibility of the church and church leaders specifically to take care of the well-being of their members. The Pope couldn't just decide that I'm the Pope, I can do what I want. Their goal, their mission needed to be the caring and for the and shepherding of those who were under them. So again, there were those who opposed the wealthy Avignon papacy and the corruption that they saw there, and these would be what I would call some early reformers or some pre-reformers have called them. This is again 100 years before the actual Protestant Reformation is going to kick off with Martin Luther. But guys like John Wycliffe, who are teaching in England in the 1300s, and then one of his disciples, Jan Hus, or John Hus, right, who modern day the Czech Republic and Bohemia and that region. Interestingly, right, he is martyred, burned at the stake for what he taught in 1415, which is the same year as the Battle of Agincourt that occurred over in France. So just for context there. Right, the followers of John Wycliffe were the Lollards, and easier to remember are the Hussites, who followed John Hus, or Jan Hus. They challenged papal infallibility. They didn't believe in transubstantiation. They believed that the breaking of bread was just a symbol remembering the Lord. And they focused on the primacy of scriptures. To the extent, right, that they were so controversial that eventually the Pope is going to excommunicate them, and Lollardy, or following, right, the teachings of John Wycliffe, becomes a capital offense. Henry V, who helped won the Battle of Agincourt, that king, he actually made it a capital offense and started burning Lollards at the stake. Jan Hus, like we said, eventually was martyred by the Catholic Church. It's interesting, right? Later, John Foxe in his Book of Martyrs writes, "Though they digged up his body," this is referring to John Wycliffe, "burnt his bones and drowned his ashes, yet the word of God and the truth of his doctrine with the fruit and success thereof they could not burn, which yet to this day doth remain." So he's writing not long after, and he's saying of Wycliffe that, right, they hated him so much that they actually, after declaring Lollardy a capital offense, they dug up his bones and crushed them and burned them. But his testimony lives on, right? And he's no longer here on earth. He's with the Lord. Last little thing I want to mention here, right, as we've talked about nationalism and the 100 Years' War and the Black Death and early reformers, is medieval Russia. So interestingly, right, why mention them here? Well, they're going to play an important role right in the midst of this period, and we'll talk about how in a second. So a little context. Back in 980 to 1015, the Russians had a ruler named Prince Vladimir, and he made a decision to decide what the national religion ought to be to unite his people. And so he had a Jewish rabbi come in, and he had a Muslim imam come in, a Greek Orthodox, a Catholic, and some others come, and he said, "Convince me that your religion is the right one." And supposedly the Greek Orthodox was the most convincing, and so the Russians adopted the Greek Orthodox or Orthodox religious practices. Well, much later, right, a few centuries later, the Mongols, the Tatars from the east, invaded and took over Russia. And what happened, right, is after a while, a lot of the Russians and others had fled into the woods and hid from the Mongols, and this is where Moscow, modern-day Moscow, was founded and built. They eventually, right, are able to fight off the descendants of the Mongols. And when they do, right, after 1453, right, you get this kind of strong, liberated central government in central Russia there. After 1453, which is the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, right, there really no longer is they would have been the kind of the heads of the Orthodox Church. And so they actually called themselves the Third Rome, and they took on the title, the self-given title of the Guardians of Orthodox Civilization. And again, for our intents and purposes, when we're trying to understand the Western world, this would be the collapse of Rome. But all of a sudden, Russia is going to start to play an important role in the history of the West and religion. And that may play a huge role in the rest of this course in Western Civ 1. But when you get to Western Civ 2, the role of Russia and the impact on the West down to the present day is really significant. So like I said, we've talked about nationalism, England and France, and the 100-Year War, the impact of the Black Plague, how the church is breaking down and things are really changing, and they're going to try to hold on to their power, and we're kind of setting up for what will be the Protestant Reformation. We talked about the early and pre-reformers, and then Russia's important role. So hopefully this has been helpful if we're trying to understand what was happening, what led to what becomes in some people's minds the end of the Hundred Years' War, and sorry, not the end of the Middle Ages. So what's the date? Is it 1453 with the collapse of the Byzantines? Is it the end of the Hundred Years' War? Right, there's debate out there, and it's probably more flexible and continuous than some people might want to believe. But hopefully this was helpful, and we'll look for, hopefully you do well on the unit quiz, and we'll look forward to continuing to process this material when we move to chapter 10. God bless.